I don't talk about this a lot, so most people have no idea that Pete and I have been really good friends for a few years now. I'm so grateful that he watches all my videos and gives me feedback so that I can continue to get better. But I don't want you to think that our close friendship in any way would ever influence this video. What's up guys, Sagi here, and welcome to another Tech Gear Talk. Today I'm going to tell you about how you can use ND filters to drastically improve the quality of your content. And in all seriousness, this is one of the most important accessories that you can have in your bag. I want to thank PolarPro for sending me some of the gear that I'll show you in this video. I'm going to talk about photography and video, ND and variable ND, what's the difference, why you should use them, and what makes for a good filter. I'm also going to give you some practical tips for how to use them, show you how you can save a bunch of money when you're choosing a filter, and then finally I'll show you something about these particular filters that was life-changing. You know that I like to keep things simple, so let's start with what an ND filter is and what it does. An ND filter, which stands for neutral density, and you'll see why in a minute, is a special filter that's designed to reduce the amount of light that passes through it and then ultimately gets through your lens onto your sensor. And if this isn't the first video you've seen about ND filters, you've probably heard someone say that it's like having sunglasses for your lens. Basically, it's a darkened piece of glass or resin, and if you look around, you'll see that they come in different strengths. And you'll see that the filters are referred to in terms of stops or optical density, and then sometimes ND factor, and that depends on the manufacturer. Now for this to make sense, let's take a quick moment to discuss what a stop of light means. A stop of light is a doubling or a halving of the amount of light that hits the sensor. So to increase your exposure by a stop of light means that you're doubling the amount of light. To decrease your exposure by a stop of light means that you're cutting the amount of light in half. You can already do this with your camera without a filter, as you can either slow down or speed up your shutter speed, or you can open or close your aperture. Now a very simple example is, let's say you're shooting with a 2-second shutter speed and you change it to a 1-second shutter speed. So obviously you're cutting it in half. You basically brought down your exposure by 1 stop. You therefore also reduce the amount of light hitting the sensor by half because the shutter is only open for half of the time. Now if you watched my exposure video, you'll see why I'm not including ISO here. It does affect your exposure and you can use it, but it's not actually changing the amount of light that hits the sensor, it's just changing how sensitive the sensor is to light. Now one last thing, which I'll touch on more when we talk about what makes for a good filter, is the neutral part. The filter is supposed to just block out light without changing any of the colors. Now some filters can cause a pretty drastic color cast, which you can correct in post, but it's just an extra step that you have to deal with. Okay, now that we know what an ND filter is, let's look at a variable ND filter. A variable ND filter serves the same purpose as a fixed ND filter, but it's constructed of 2 polarizing filters. Now, as you rotate the front filter, you're either increasing or decreasing the amount of light that you're letting through, depending on the direction. So instead of a fixed value, let's say something like 3 stops, a variable ND filter will have a range. Now with these PolarPro Variable ND filters, you can choose between the 2 to 5 stops and the 6 to 9 stops, depending on which works best for what you plan on doing. And I'll help you pick the right one for you later on in this video. Okay, I want to head off something before we move on. There's some criticisms regarding variable ND filters, and these are mostly the byproduct of the fact that we're using 2 polarizing filters. And I know that I can completely eliminate these criticisms by using fixed ND filters, but for how I shoot and for the convenience that a good variable ND filter offers, I still think it's the best choice. I'm out there shooting alone, I carry all my own gear, and I don't have an assistant that would carry all the extra gear I would need, a matte box that swap out filters for me. So I'm willing to compromise very slightly on image quality for convenience. And for the most part, we do this anyways. I'll give you an example. I know that I can carry a series of prime lenses, which would give me amazing results. I could bring a 24, a 35, a 50, an 85, be super fast and incredibly sharp. But for the most part, I would rather just carry a 24 to 70 f2.8, which almost covers the entire focal range and still gives me really good results without having to carry 4 lenses. Before we get to when you should use ND and variable ND filters, if you like what you've seen so far, let me know by giving this video a thumbs up. This way I know what kind of content is being useful so that I can create more of it. And if it's your first time here, go ahead and hit the subscribe and notification buttons so you can stay up to date on all the latest gear reviews and tutorials. All right, so let's get back to these filters. For the most part, when I'm shooting stills, I don't need an ND filter. If I'm shooting something like portraits, I can just use a really fast shutter speed, like 1/8,000th of a second if I need to, and that would cut down enough light even on a super bright sunny day. I mostly use an ND filter when I want to introduce motion blur. So for example, if I'm photographing waterfalls and I want that super smooth look, I would use an ND 1000, which is essentially a 10-stop filter. And this lets me slow the shutter speed down to 6, 8, or 10 seconds, which is plenty for what I need. And the reason why I mostly use a fixed ND filter here is that I have a lot more flexibility when it comes to shutter speed and aperture with my photos than I do with my video. And because of that, I can mostly just carry one of these and be done. This ND 1000 has a super solid brass frame, and it's made of a 99.99 fused quartz glass, which gives it excellent optical clarity. And I like the fact that, again, it's super solid and almost rugged and gives me good quality. So this is pretty much the only fixed ND filter I carry with me. Now, the natural question might be, can't you use fixed ND filters for video? And the answer is absolutely. If you're comfortable with bringing a series of different filters at different stops, if you're willing to take the time to screw and unscrew them every time a cloud moves in front or away from the sun, if you have that extra time and flexibility during your shots, then by all means you can just get a whole bunch of fixed ND filters and they'll give you excellent results. But like I said before, for how I shoot, that's just not gonna happen. And let's not forget that video is more restrictive than photography in this case because of the 180-degree rule. So essentially that means that we always want our shutter speed to be twice that of our frame rate. So if we're shooting at 24 frames per second, we want a shutter speed of about 1/50th of a second. If we're shooting at 30 frames per second, we want it to be 1/60th of a second. And if we're shooting at 60 frames per second, and I mostly use 1/125, 1/25th of a second, is that even how you say it? 1/125th of a second? I'm gonna go with that. Now, because we're shooting with such slow shutter speed, it's very likely that we'll run into situations when we're outside and we just have too much light. Now you might say, but can't you just close down your aperture? Definitely. And when I'm in a pinch, that's exactly what I do. But for the most part, I like to get very shallow depth of field for my videos, which means that I'm using super wide apertures like f1.8 or f1.4. And that means that I'm letting a ton of light through the lens, and I'll definitely need to block some of it to get a proper exposure. I also can't use the aperture because I need a consistent depth of field. So if I'm shooting something like a talking head portion, I can't have the background be in focus in one clip, then out of focus in another one, then back in focus, then back out of focus. That would just look terrible when I edit it all together. So a variable ND filter lets me make these adjustments very quickly, and I can make a slight or significant change even while I'm shooting. So if I'm in mid-sentence, I could just reach over, turn the filter, and then re-record that last sentence. I'm not removing a filter, having to figure out which one I need to use, putting one away, screwing a new one on, testing it. I just twist and then I'm good to go. Okay, so now you see why I use variable ND filters, why I think it's a good idea. So let's talk about what makes a good variable ND filter. And then I'll tell you why I'm using these now instead of the one that I used before. First, I want you to think about how much time you spend picking a camera, lenses, how much money you invest in getting the best quality gear that you can afford. Conceptually, do you want to take a bad piece of glass and put it in front of all this great gear? I don't think so. In order to figure out what makes for a good variable ND filter, let's talk about some of the issues with these filters. Remember that I said that a variable ND filter is essentially two polarizing filters? But the problem is that a polarizing filter is used to do things like darken the skies, manage reflections, and suppress glare. Now in this case, we don't necessarily want all or any of those to happen. We just want to block out some of the light. Now variable ND filters that are not very good are still going to block out the light, but you're going to see things like having one part of the image be darker than the other, like when you're shooting a sky on a bright day. You'll see certain colors start to pop, and then you'll also notice a color cast that you're not gonna like. And when you're using a polarizing filter, ideally, you wanna shoot with the sun on your left or on your right, meaning that you're shooting 90 degrees from the angle of the sun. But realistically, again, for how I shoot, I just don't have the time or the option to always recompose the entire shot. I might be on a gimbal and I'm walking around someone, or they change direction and I quickly need to react to that. So I need a filter that will help me when I'm shooting in less than optimal conditions. One other issue with variable ND filters is the dreaded X pattern. No mutants or anything like that, but if you're not familiar with this phenomenon, as you get too close to the point where the two polarizing filters are at 90 degrees to each other, you start to see this horrible X pattern on your shot. So what's great here is that the PolarPro Variable ND filters do a very good job with both of these issues. They almost completely remove the darker areas, and the light distribution throughout the frame is really good, even when I'm not shooting at the ideal angle from the sun. Now, as far as the X pattern, both the 2-to-5 and the 6-to-9 PolarPro filters come with hard stops at each end of the range. So with my previous filter, I could just continue to rotate it below the minimum or beyond the maximum. So if I wasn't paying attention, it was really easy to ruin my shot. Now with PolarPro, if I'm using a 2-to-5 filter, then when it gets to 2, it completely stops rotating. And when it gets to 5, it completely stops. So there is no chance that I could rotate it beyond the highest or lowest designated stop. Now speaking of stops, I love that PolarPro filters have actual numbers on them instead of just dots like what I had on my old filter. So with my old filter, there were just these markings that were essentially meaningless. They didn't really correlate to anything, so turning the filter by 2 dots didn't mean that you were now blocking twice as much light. It was sort of arbitrary. Now with the PolarPros, there are actual numbers and markings telling you if you're at 2, 3, 4, and finally 5 stops. So I found this to be much more convenient and accurate. Now the next issue people have with variable ND filters is vignetting. And there is truth to that. You can't 100% eliminate vignetting at super wide focal lengths. What I'm looking for is something that would let me get excellent results in the most convenient way. I want to get the shot that I need, have it look good, and move on. And the PolarPro says that there is 0 vignetting down to 16 millimeters. There probably is a very, very slight vignette at 16 millimeters if I shot a perfectly evenly lit white wall and looked for one, but I don't usually do that with my free time. What I can tell you is that I get very good results, and I would never think twice about using any of the footage that I got, even when going as wide as 16. Another issue that some variable ND filters have is color cast. Remember the neutral part? We don't want to add any color, we just want to block out the light. Now because we're using polarizers, some form of color cast is most likely going to happen, especially at higher stops. But like we talked about before, it's a matter of degrees. This is an area where as you pay more, you should expect to get less and less of a color cast. I found that the PolarPro filters performed very well, and probably as well as variable ND filters that cost almost twice as much. So you could pay a lot more and get very slightly better results if you really wanted to. But I have other things that I'd rather spend my money on, like the endless list of lenses that I want. Am I the only one? Now, speaking of saving money, I want to give you a simple tip and then we'll get to the life-changing part. Now, if you go to the PolarPro website, you'll see that these variable ND filters come in 3 different thread sizes, 67, 77, and 82. What you want to do is look at your lenses and then find this annotation which will give you the filter thread size. But what if you want to use this same filter on different size lenses? Like, do you need to go and buy multiple filters? Nope. What you want to do is get one that will fit your largest lens and then buy step-up rings for all your smaller lenses. So for example, you can get the 82 millimeter and then get a 62, 67, 72, and 77 step-up rings so that you can use that same larger filter with lenses ranging all the way from 62 to 82. And these step-up rings will just screw onto your lens, and then the ND filter will screw into the step-up ring. And I really like these step-up rings from PolarPro. They look and feel really nice, but most importantly, they have this very deep knurling, that's a word. I didn't even know that was a word. I guess I would have just called them super rugged. And the reason why this is so important is that it's amazingly easy to screw these on and off your camera and to remove them from your filter. And these are not cheap. So they're gonna cost, I think it's like $39 each. But Sagi, that's really expensive for a brass ring. No, what's really expensive is buying a super cheap $6 step-up ring on Amazon, then putting it on and then putting your awesome filter on and then being unable to separate them. Then you try the rope trick and it still doesn't come off, so you eventually have to just grab pliers, which will get the ring off and will also ruin the threads on your $250 filter. Seriously, don't do it. Invest in good step-up rings. You'll never need to buy them again. This is definitely a buy it nice or buy it twice situation. Now, I mentioned this before that the filters come in 2 strengths, the 2 to 5 stop and the 6 to 9 stop variation. And here's how you pick. Most people are gonna do just fine with the 2 to 5 stop version. It's perfect for someone who's running and gunning and works well even with fast lenses in most conditions. Now, the 6 to 9 stop variation is excellent for someone who wants to work with super fast lenses on a bright day. So for example, something like f2.8, f2, f1.4, f1.2, those lenses let in a ton of light. Now on top of that, if you're shooting in log because you want to capture better dynamic range and you want more information to work with in post-production, your camera is very likely to raise your minimum ISO, sometimes to values higher than 800. This is super important to think about because for the most part, on a bright sunny day, you're going to want to use the lowest ISO value that you can because you want the cleanest image and you have plenty of light to work with. But raising your minimum ISO from, let's say, 100 to 800 is the equivalent of 3 stops of light right there. That means that you need a variable ND filter to block 3 stops of light just to get to the same exposure that you were gonna get if you were shooting at ISO 100. And this is where having the additional strength is awesome to have. If this was even a little confusing, I know I talked about a lot there, let me know in the comment section and I'll explain it because I want you to get the one that works best for you. And of course, if it's in your budget and you have use for both, you can save $100 by buying a kit with both filters. All right, remember that I told you about something that was life-changing? Okay, so because I mostly run and gun, one of the most frustrating parts of a variable ND filter is that I can't put the camera back in my bag without having to take the filter off because the lens cap doesn't fit anymore. And not only that, I actually don't like traditional lens caps because they always fall off in my bag. Like when I use something like my Think Tank Airport International, that doesn't happen because there is more structure to the bag, but in my backpack, they always come off and then make their way to the bottom. So PolarPro includes this thing called the Defender Slim. So seriously, now this is brilliant. Basically, it's a rigid ABS plate that's somehow molded with a softer elastomer. So what you get is something that easily fits over your lens, won't come off during travel, like ever, is still easy to remove when you want to, and protects your lens better than your original cap. And the reason why I say better is that your original cap isn't protecting your $2,800 lens at all when it's floating at the bottom of your bag. Now, as far as the variable ND, that means that I can now pop this Defender back on the filter and put the camera back in the bag And then when I take it out, it's ready to be used. And I don't have to mess around with removing and remounting the filter every time. On top of that, it makes it super easy to screw the filter on without having to worry about touching the front of the filter with your hand or dropping the filter, because the Defender adds a ton of grip. And when I want to put the filter away, it's stored with the Defender on it, so it's always protected. And it's ready for me to just grab and install. If you haven't used filters before and had to deal with taking them off and putting them on each time you want to shoot, or having to change lenses, this might sound like it's not really that big a deal. And if you've watched my channel before, you know that I tell it to you how it is. This was such an annoyance for me before, and when I have an opportunity to remove friction from the creative process, I go for it, because these seemingly small things add up and they create a much less enjoyable user experience, which honestly leads me to creating less. And I remember seeing this Defender in one of their promo videos and thinking it was kind of a throwaway item. Yeah, well, guess what? Now I use the full-size Defenders for my actual lenses. They come in 5 sizes, which cover lenses with 55 to 115 millimeter outer diameter. So you can use your filter size thread as a guide. Now, whether you end up getting these variable ND filters or not, you should definitely buy a couple of these for your lenses. When I reach for an expensive lens in my bag and it comes out without a cap, I'm like, and now I know this thing is staying on, it's not going anywhere, and I'm super confident that it's protecting my lenses. Now, speaking of protection, the filters also come with a very solid magnetic case. I like that they added the markings on the case so I can very quickly know which filter thread size and strength they are without having to open and take a look. All right, now I want to know what you think about the features and performance of the PolarPro Variable ND filters. And which version would you get? Pete, I'll wait to hear your comments. The 2 to 5 stop version sells for $249. The 6 to 9 stop is $299. And if you buy them both together, you can get them for $449, which saves you $100. I'll put links in the description to where you can get everything that I talked about in this video. There are always holiday specials and discounts, so the links will be automatically updated with the lowest pricing. When you order anything using the links in the description, not just these items, you can help support my channel for free and help me create more content for you, so thank you in advance. If this video was helpful, please let me know by giving it a thumbs up, tweet it, share it, and if you haven't yet, join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification buttons. You can always find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk. You know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.